Well, I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon on circumcision in my entire life. Certainly had never prepared for one until this week. This is a strange chapter. I think there's obvious reasons why I haven't heard one. Probably you're in the same boat. But today what we're going to do is I want to look at two main questions in Genesis 17. Two aspects of the strangeness of the chapter. The first is if God made a covenant with Abram in Genesis 15, which he did, it was 2 weeks ago, why does he do it again here in Genesis 17? What's different about this covenant from that covenant? And then second, why establish circumcision, this bloody act, as the sign of God's covenant? What does it mean? Why do that? And in order to answer those questions, we're going to have to do a little bit of a recap. So the first part of this sermon is a recap of the story of Abram up until this point. And so as you listen to me retell what we've been doing for the past 4 or 5 weeks, I want you to focus on two aspects of Abram's story. The first is the increasing specificity of God's promise, and the second is the increasing maturity and growing faith of Abram. Now, when we meet Abram in Genesis 11, he is living with his father Terah, his nephew Lot, in the land of Haran. He's about 75 years old. He has no children because we're told his wife Sarah is barren. After the death of his father, God calls Abram in Genesis 12 to leave his country and his kindred, and God makes some very great promises to Abram. However, the initial promise in Genesis 12 is very broad. It contains a lot of unknowns. Go to the land I will show you, God says. But which land and how big it is and where it is, God doesn't say. He just says, I'm going to show it to you. Second, he says, I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to make you great so that you will be a blessing. But significantly, there's no mention of children at this point in the promise in Genesis 12. Third, I'm going to protect you. I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, for the sake of all the families of the earth. Now, Abram listens and follows the Lord, and he becomes a priest, establishing worship in the land that God shows him. So we talked about this a few weeks ago. He claims the land through worship. He's a priest following this God, building altars where people can call upon the name of the Lord. In chapter 13, we get a focus on this land that God will show Abram. Abram and Lot separate because the land can't support them, and then God gives greater specificity. Okay, earlier in 12 it was broad, now it's specific. It's this land right here, Abram. And he takes Abram on a walking tour of Canaan. Look up to the south, look to the north, look to the east, look to the west. See this land. And in Genesis 13, verse 15, we get the first mention of offspring. Abram's offspring will be as the sand of the dust of the earth. This land will belong to Abram's offspring, and they will be numerous. And so Abram continues his priestly work, building more altars and offering God simple, basic worship. In Genesis 14, we talked a few weeks ago about how Abram's increasing maturity and prominence is seen in the way that he rescues Lot from a confederation of kings in the midst of a great war. He defeats these kings in battle. He rejects gifts, payment from a wicked king, and he pays tribute to a godly king. And this was a new insight to me as I was preparing this week, reflecting on the story. In other words, Abram here in that story in Genesis 14 distinguishes between good and evil. King of Sodom, evil. Melchizedek, good. And if you remember back when we did our sermon on Genesis 3, we argued that the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 3, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is the tree of wisdom, of royal wisdom, of kingly wisdom. Wisdom is what kings need to rule. They need to be able to distinguish between good and evil. And in Genesis 14, we see Abram be a king, distinguishing between good and evil and protecting, exercising dominion over God's land. Moving then quickly to Genesis 15, Abram becomes a prophet. He's lived in the land for about 3 years. Another insight I read in a commentary this week that really helped me. Remember we talked a few weeks ago about why does it have to be a heifer 3 years old and a ram 3 years old? Well, if we pay attention to the timeline, Abram's been in the land for 3 years. And so this commentator suggested, and this seems plausible to me, that these are the first fruits of this land. Abram's been there 3 years. These animals were born and bred in Canaan, and now they've grown up and they need to be offered to God. I thought that makes some sense. That helps explain a funny detail to me. Abram's 78 years old. God appears to him, encourages him in his faith, and addresses the problems with the promise. He says, Abram, one from your loins will be your heir, not your servant. So now we get more specific. First it was, I'm going to make you great. Then it was, I'm going to give you offspring. And then it's, no, really, one from your loins will be your heir, and your descendants will be countless as the stars. We get the strange ritual we talked about a few weeks ago, the flaming torch, smoking fire pot through the divided animals. This is the presence of God moving through the land, binding Abram to it, in anticipation of the Exodus. And in fact, God gives Abram greater detail, again, deepening his understanding of the future. Know for certain that your offspring will sojourn in a foreign land. They will be afflicted for 400 years. God will judge the oppressive nation, and Abram's children will come out with great wealth and then come back to the promised land. At that time, Abram also gets greater definition about the promised land. It stretches from the Nile in Egypt to the river Euphrates and includes all the territories of these peoples, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and so forth. And finally, here in Genesis 15, for the first time, God's promise becomes a covenant. Now, a covenant, it differs from a promise in that a covenant is a formal relationship, a ratified relationship. It has order and structure. It has promises and oaths. It has blessings and curses. So God has gone from a promise, an invitation, hey, I'll give you some land. I'll go to the land, I'll show you. I'll make you great, to a formal relationship established between God and Abram. However, at this point in the story, Genesis 15, the focus is on God's initiation, God's promise, and all Abram does is respond in simple faith. I believe. I believe you, God. He has the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, in Genesis 16, this was last week, priest, king, and prophet Abram is now 85 years old. So 7 years waiting on that promise. One from your loins, waiting. No doubt, trying. He and his wife trying to conceive a son. But they don't. And so, as Pastor Jonathan pointed out last week, finally, Sarah gets tired of waiting. Abram and Sarah take matters into their own hands. And as he pointed out last week, there are many echoes of the fall of Genesis 3 in Genesis 16. Let me just remind you of them. This is Abram and Sarah's fall. They've been faithful. They've followed God. And here in Genesis 16, we have a fall into sin. So, in Genesis 3, God gave the command to Adam, who then instructed his wife Eve. In Genesis 15 and 16, God made the promise to Abram, who then passed it on to his wife Sarah. In Genesis 3, Eve believes that God is withholding something good from them. Right? That's what the devil tells her. You'll become like God, knowing good and evil. And God doesn't want that for you. God's withholding something good from you. In Genesis 16, Sarah believes that the Lord is withholding something from her, preventing her from having children. In Genesis 3, Eve gives the forbidden fruit to Adam. In Genesis 16, Sarah gives her servant Hagar to Abram. In both cases, the couple believes that taking the fruit or taking Hagar will lead to blessing and honor and glory for them. This will be good for us. However, in both passages, seizing what's forbidden only leads to shame and blame. Hagar looks with contempt upon her barren mistress, just as Adam and Eve knew their nakedness and were ashamed. And then Sarah blames Abram for all of it. The Lord judge between you and me. May God fix what you've broken. This is all your fault. Just as Adam and Eve blamed others for their sin. Now, at that point in Genesis 16 last week, we get a variation. In Genesis 3, you remember God drives Adam and Eve out of the garden. In Genesis 16, it's not Abram and Sarah who are driven out. It's Hagar who's driven out. She flees, pregnant, into the wilderness. And I just wanted to insert a little word about Hagar here. As I was preparing, I just couldn't pass this by. In Genesis 16, Hagar is not the temptress. She's not the temptress. She's not the seductress. She doesn't tempt Abram to fall. Sarah does that. Sarah's the one who encourages him to seize the promise in his own way. Hagar, in that analogy, is the fruit. She's an Egyptian servant, a slave. She's a pawn in the situation. She didn't have a lot of power in this story. She's a servant. She's a slave. Sarah can do with her what she wants. Take my servant. Have a child by her. This servant made me mad. Get out of here. I hate you. She's to be used by Abram and Sarah and then discarded. Now, she's not completely innocent. She does show contempt for a hurting and broken woman. So she's both sinned against and she sins. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, there are people probably in this room who feel like that. You've been used by important people. You've served their needs and been rejected once they're done with you. You've been sinned against, and in response, maybe you sinned back. And you might feel dirty and used and worthless, and you might just want to run away and get away from it all. And so Hagar was an encouragement to me this week, because you may have been used by people, but the lesson of Hagar is you've not been forgotten by God. You may have been used by people. You may just be fruit. Eaten, thrown away. Who cares? You've not been forgotten by God. In Genesis 16, God meets Hagar in the wilderness. He promises to multiply her offspring. He urges her to be faithful in this hard situation. Go back, submit to your mistress. And then listen to these words. Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. Does that sound familiar? Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. Does it sound familiar? Anybody want to take a shot? This is call and response now. Call his name Emmanuel. It's the story, it's what God says to Mary, the Virgin Mary. In Luke chapter 131, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son. And here it's actually, you shall call his name Jesus. Joseph is the one who gets the Emmanuel word. But the name Ishmael here means God hears. Call his name, God hears. And then Hagar says, you are surely a God who sees. She met the one who was looking after her. So if you're used and broken today, if you feel that, you sinned against and sinning, know that God hears. God sees. God looks after you. God is with you. So that's Genesis 16. Now, all that brings us here to Genesis 17. Fast forward. Abram's now 99 years old. 75 when he came to the land. 78 when he got that promise from God. 85 when they decided to enact the Ishmael plan, the Hagar plan. And 13 years later, it looks like it worked. You have to get that. It looks like it worked. Ishmael was born. He's grown up in their house. No doubt all of Abram's hopes for the future are bound up with him. One from my loins, there he is. No doubt still some tension and bitterness between Hagar and Sarah. But there have been 13 years of believing that the promises are coming true because of what Abram and Sarah and Hagar did. And then here in Genesis 17, God shows up and wants to talk about this covenant. Now, I'm not sure whether we should call this a covenant renewal or simply a deepening of the covenant. I'm not sure which way is the best way to talk about it. I just want you to notice that like we've been seeing in this earlier parts of the story, there's greater specificity and detail here in Genesis 17. So let's look at this greater specificity and then see there's something radically new here in Genesis 17. Here's the 5 new things that we can see in Genesis 17. Number 1, God is going to multiply nations from Abram, so much so that he needs a name change. He's now Abraham, father of many nations. Number 2, not only nations, but kings will come from Abraham. Chapter 17, verse 6. Look for it right there. The covenant, verse 7, will be an everlasting covenant. Number 4, God promises his perpetual presence with his people. He will be God to this people. He will be to them God for them. And number 5, the land of Canaan will be their everlasting possession. So again, like we've seen, God's general promise in Genesis 12 is getting more specific, more detailed. God's more committed to this and giving Abram greater insight. Multiple nations, kings, everlasting covenant, perpetual presence, everlasting possession. Genesis 17 deepens and fills out God's commitment in this covenant. But then you get the new element. This is fundamentally new from the earlier passages. This passage highlights Abram's obligations in the covenant. Think of it this way. Genesis 12, God basically makes Abram an offer. Go to the land and I'll bless you. And Abram says, I'll take you up on that offer. Genesis 15, Abram's grown and matured. God lets him in on the plan and says, this offer is now a covenant. It's more than just an offer, it's a covenant. Know for certain about the future, about what's coming. And in response, Abram believes. Simple faith in what God will do. It's all about God in Genesis 15 and his promise. Now, here in 17, God is formalizing it. God makes promises and has obligations. Abram does too. Abraham and his descendants now, verse 9 and 10, must keep the covenant. That's new. They have to keep the covenant. And apparently at this point, what it means to keep the covenant is simply take upon you the covenant sign. For Abram and his descendants, signing on the dotted line, that's what's happening right here, okay? There was an initial offer, acceptance of the offer, now you got to sign the papers. Here's signing on the dotted line. It takes the form of circumcision. A bloody cutting off of the foreskin. Anyone who won't cut off the foreskin breaks the covenant and will be cut off from the people, verse 14. Now, that's strange. That's a really, really strange way. The bloody cutting off of part of the body is the sign of God's covenant. Why? In order to understand that, we actually have to look at the rest of Genesis 17. There's more newness and detail for us to pick up on. Later in the next part of the chapter, we discover something else about the promise of Abram's offspring. Not only did God not forget Hagar, he didn't forget Sarah either. Remember, in Genesis 15, you remember what it said? Abram, one from your loins, but it didn't say anything about Sarah. Nothing about Sarah. That's probably why, after 7 years of trying to conceive, Sarah simply concludes, God's done with me. He's preventing me from having children. So that promise that God made to Abraham doesn't include me. I'm just going to have to be like a surrogate mom. I'm just going to raise a child that's not my own. God must intend to fulfill this promise some other way, and so the Hagar plan, the Ishmael plan, is born. And for 13 years, it looks like Sarah was right. The Ishmael plan was the right plan. And now, God shows up and says, no, I haven't forgotten you, Sarah. Sarah will conceive and have a son. Verse 16, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her. She shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Not just you, Abram, her. Sarah will conceive. Her son, not Ishmael, will be the heir of this everlasting covenant that God is establishing. It's from Sarah that the nations and kings will come. Sarah's loins will be as fruitful as Abraham's. Now, Abraham, of course, is incredulous. He can't believe it. Earlier in the passage, when God shows up, he said, God says, walk before me, and Abraham falls down. Walk before me, fall down. Just worship. That's how you walk before God. You worship. Here, he falls down again, this time with laughter. In his head, he says, shall a child be born when I'm 100 and she's 90? To God, he says, oh, that Ishmael may live before you. Come on, that's crazy. It's crazy talk, God, to think that my 90-year-old wife is going to have a baby. Just let the Ishmael plan work. Use the Ishmael plan, God. It's a good plan. It's been hard and really awkward around the house for a while. It's been tense. It's cost us a lot. But it's worked 13 years. Let's stick with the Ishmael plan. And God says, no. Verse 19. No to the Ishmael plan. Sarah matters here. So does Hagar. So does Ishmael. God doesn't reject Ishmael. We find out he made a promise to Hagar. He's going to keep it. Ishmael will also be a great nation. He'll have 12 princes, which anticipates the 12 tribes of Israel that will be born to Jacob. So he's like a little microcosm of Israel before Israel comes. But he will not be the heir of the covenant. Isaac, the child of Abram and Sarah, will be the heir. Now, at this point, I'd love to talk about the way that God uses even our sinful missteps for his glory and our good. They came up with a plan, they enacted it, God used it anyway. He folded it in, he wove it into his story and made the story even better. No purpose of God's going to be thwarted by our attempts to get around it. I'd also like to reflect on how Genesis 16 and 7 shows the dignity of women. God didn't forget Hagar. God didn't forget Sarah. They are as important in this story as Abraham is. I'd love to talk about the way that God is affirming the dignity of marriage. Not your plan with the servant. Your wife is involved here. I'd love to talk about that. But we got to answer the big question about circumcision. So now let's turn to that. Okay. To begin, we need to note at the very end of the passage stresses Abram's complete and total obedience. In verse 23, we're told Abraham took Ishmael his son, all those born in his house or bought with his money, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day as God had said to him. Immediate, total obedience. Abraham's all in, signing on the dotted line. It gets reiterated in verse 26. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. No delay, no thinking it over. He's seen God show himself faithful time and time again. He presses into the covenant. This bond takes the sign upon himself. Now, why? Why this sign? First, we need to note that circumcision is a sign of something. 17, verse 11. It shall be a sign of the covenant between you and me, which means it's a symbol. Circumcision represents something. You're supposed to not just look at the act, but see what does the act point to. So let's think about what it represents. To understand that, I want you to remember two things about the early chapters of Genesis. Number one, remember after the fall, the spread of sin, the corruption of all flesh, and the judgment of God. So let me just remind you of this. Adam and Eve sinned, exiled from God's presence, and then sin and violence spread from them through Cain and Abel, through Lamech who had many wives, through the compromised sons of God who marry the daughters of man. Sin spreads out, fills the whole earth with violence, and corrupts all flesh. Genesis 6, verse 12. Corrupts all flesh. That's what sin does. So that God determines to destroy all flesh, that's the language, make an end of all flesh through the flood. God is at war with corrupt flesh, with corrupt humanity. And so God does. He makes an end of all flesh, except for Noah and those in the ark. And then after the flood, God puts a covenant sign in the sky, the rainbow, and listen to chapter 9, verse 11 of Genesis. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by floodwaters. I want you to remember that. Never again shall all flesh be cut off. Those two words. Second thing to remember, Genesis 3:15. God promised to crush the serpent and put the world to rights through a male offspring of the woman. And we ought to see the promise to Abram, beginning in Genesis 12, as a fulfillment of that promise. Now, God made a promise. He shall... the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And then now there's all this stuff about Abraham's seed. Worshippers of God in this day are looking and waiting for a male child who's going to fix the world, who's going to crush the serpent, who's going to put things back together. And the covenant with Abraham has something to do with this male seed, this male offspring who will crush the serpent's head. So remember those two facts and then think with me about circumcision. God's at war with the corruption of all flesh, and God's promise to send a male child to put the world to rights. Now, what does that have to do with circumcision? Two things. Number one, circumcision is a symbolic death to avoid ultimate death. In circumcision, Abraham cuts off the foreskin so that God doesn't cut him off completely. Circumcision acts in this way like Noah's Ark. Okay, think about it. Okay? In Noah's Ark, God separated out Noah and his family and the animals from all flesh who were about to be cut off by the flood. It's like, if you remember the story of the Passover, where they slaughter an animal and then they sprinkle blood over the doorpost to separate themselves from the Egyptians as the angel of death comes through and wipes out the firstborn of all Egypt. Okay, like that blood on the doorpost, like Noah's Ark, circumcision is a bloody sign. It's a symbolic death so that you don't get cut off when God's judgment comes. It is no accident that Genesis 17 is followed by Genesis 18 and 19 when the angel of the Lord comes down to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, not with a flood, but with sulfur and fire. God is about to come in and purge this land, purge the corruption, and Abraham needs to be cut off so that he's not cut off. Abraham cuts off part of his flesh so that he's not cut off in God's total war against the corruption of all flesh. He marks himself with a sign, a bloody, symbolic death, so that he doesn't get swept away by judgment. Second, circumcision is, in the Bible, a symbolic castration. If the hope of the world is a male child who will crush the serpent, if the hope of Abraham is a male heir to inherit the blessing, the promises, the land, circumcision acknowledges Abraham's impotence to accomplish that hope. Circumcision cuts off the flesh in order to say, I don't place any confidence in the flesh. Human flesh is hopeless. It's a sign of the covenant. It's a sign of the righteousness that Abraham has by faith. His faith in God to do impossible things like bring countless offspring from a weak old man and a barren woman. That's impossible. You're right, Abraham. According to human flesh, that's impossible. Express that faith through circumcision. In other words, think about this. In circumcision, Abraham is renouncing the Ishmael plan. The Ishmael plan was about confidence in the flesh. The Hagar plan, the Ishmael plan, was born in unbelief and impatience. God promised a child. We're tired of waiting. So we'll take matters into our hands, human hands. We will place our confidence in what we can do. By making circumcision the covenant sign, God says, Abraham, in order to have a covenant with me, you have to renounce all confidence in flesh and what flesh can do. Turn away from trusting in yourselves. The rescue of the world from sin and death will come through a male child, but it will not be because of human efforts. This means that even though today we no longer keep covenant with God by circumcising our male offspring, circumcision can still instruct us and exhort us. Because I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of Ishmael plans in this room. My life is often filled with Ishmael plans. My plans born from my impatience and unbelief in God and His promises. Plans that have caused tension and strife in my family or at my workplace. Plans that place confidence in my power, in what I can accomplish, in what I can do for myself to make things go well for me. There are lots of Ishmael plans in my life, and I'm willing to bet I'm not the only one. Genesis 17 looks at us in the New Covenant and says, put to death your Ishmael plans. Don't cling to your plans, to your self-made efforts, to your power. You are powerless to do good to yourself. Your plans, all they produce is shame and blame and tension and bitterness. Now, God has promises for you, new goods that you can't even imagine. So be patient. Trust Him. Hope in Him to do the impossible. He created the world from nothing. He can make the barren give birth. He is with you. He is for you. He is your God, and He is mighty to save. That's what Genesis 17 says to us today, which brings us to the table. I said, in the new covenant, we no longer keep covenant with God through circumcision. That's old. It's done. The New Testament is abundantly clear about this fact, and this table is the reason why. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul tells us that we, here, have been circumcised without hands. That is, it's not a physical act done to the body. He says, we've been circumcised with a circumcision without hands by putting off the body of the flesh in the death of Jesus. He calls it the circumcision of Christ. The cross of Christ is the decisive and final cutting off of all corrupt flesh. Jesus was cut off for us so that we aren't destroyed in God's war against corrupt humanity. by sending his own Son, Romans 8:3, in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, God condemned sin in the flesh so that he could condemn sin but not condemn you. That's what circumcision always pointed to. Cut off the foreskin so that I can kill sin but not you. Because otherwise, all of it's getting wiped away. All of it's getting thrown down, just like in the flood, just like in Sodom and Gomorrah, just like in Egypt. It's all over for you unless something can happen so that we can condemn sin in the flesh without condemning you. That's what the cross of Jesus did for us. Paul says we share in the circumcision of Christ through baptism and faith. Buried with Jesus in baptism, raised with Jesus in baptism through our faith in the powerful working of God who raised Jesus from the dead. That's what this table's about. That's what we proclaim. So come and welcome to the circumcision of Christ. Let me pray as the servers come. Father, grateful for your goodness to us, grateful for Jesus and his work, grateful for the way that even strange, odd passages in the Old Testament can challenge us to renounce all confidence in the flesh. Be with us, O God. Help us to know that you have made your covenant and you will stand by it. You have signed it in the blood of your own Son. We look to you now in Jesus' name. Amen. As we distribute the elements, put your hand up if you'd like gluten-free. His body is the true bread. Let us serve you.